So where we last left off, we had finished defining the the balance sheets of the Treasury, the Fed, the private banking sector, and the private firms. Okay, everything was balanced, and now the only thing that we're left to do is to input the, or rather, wire up the equations that that will represent all of these actions. Okay, all of this economic activity. Okay, so we're going to have a line item for the government spending, the government taxation, the bond issuance, the bond purchases, and the interest payments. All right. So we'll come down here, get our dividers set up, put one over here, and we'll put one over here. All right. And we will bring in a note, and we'll define the first action, which, if we remember from the balance sheet, was that the government spends on the firms. All right, the government spends on the firms. Okay, and so what I'm going to do is I'm going to copy all of the stock variables from that godly table, and I'm going to copy all the flow variables from that godly table. And we're going to have that the government spending on the firms, I am going to say that the spending on the firms, oops, copied the stock variables twice. I am going to say that the government spending on the firms is going to be some percentage of GDP, which we defined in the previous video when we set up the private sector economy. Okay, so I'm going to bring over the GDP. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to define a new parameter, which is going to be the rate of spending on the firms. All right? The rate of spending on the firms. This is going to be some parameter, and it's going to be a ratio, right? It's going to be some fraction of the GDP. Okay? Right now, the government is spending about 7% GDP on the private sector in its deficit spending. So we can start out with an initial value of 7, but what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to start out with an initial value of 0, do 1 for the maximum value, 0 for the minimum value, and I'm going to do increments of 5%. Do it like that. Multiply these two together, and that product is going to be equal to the spending that the government does on the firms. Okay, so bring these guys over, bump them up a little bit, wire them together. Okay, so we have the GDP times the rate of spending, which is some fraction of GDP. All right, and that's going to be the government spending. Okay, we're going to do the exact same thing for the government taxation. Okay, so the government is going to government taxes the firms, all right, and that is also going to be equal to some fraction of GDP. So the government taxation on the firms is going to be equal to some fraction of the GDP as well. So bring this over, I'll wire that up to there, wire that up to there, and I will define a rate of taxation on the firms. This is also going to be a parameter. I'm going to have it start at 0. Imagine that, a 0% tax rate. Max will be 1, minimum will be 0, and I'm also going to go in increments of 5%. Okay? So now that's wired. And the next thing is going to be the bond issuance, right? Because if we assume that the spending, right, if we assume that the spending minus the taxation is going to be some non-zero number, then by definition, that means that we're going to be running a deficit, okay? So we're going to have the spending minus taxation is going to be equal to what we call the deficit, all right? And the deficit, by law, must be funded, quote unquote, through the sale of bonds. Okay, so the bonds that the government sells to the banks is going to be equal to the deficit. All right. Okay, so we have now the deficit spending, which produces the bond issuance. Okay, and we're going to say that this is going to be the government sells bonds to the banks equal to the deficit. All right. Boom. Okay. And so the next thing that's going to happen is that, of course, as we defined it, the banks can sell those bonds to the Fed, right? Or equivalently, the Fed can purchase those bonds off of the private banks. And when the Fed purchases bonds from the private banks, it does so as some fraction of the deficit. Okay, so we can also bring in either the deficit, or we can bring in, the bonds sold from by the government to the banks. All right, but let's just go ahead and bring in that it's going to be equal to the deficit. So I'm going to define the open market operations parameter, which is the name of the monetary policy operation where the Federal Reserve buys bonds from the private banks, also known as quantitative easing. Okay, so I'm going to say that this has an initial value of 0, a maximum value of 100%, minimum value of 0%, and we're going to go in step sizes of 5%. Okay, we're going to multiply these two together. So the deficit multiplied by the rate of purchases of, or rather, some ratio of the deficit is going to define the purchases of the bonds by the central bank, okay, or equivalently the sale of bonds from the banks to the central bank. All right, so that's going to be that guy. Okay, and I'll give this guy a description saying that this is that the central bank buys the bonds, or equivalently that the banks sell bonds to the central bank. Okay, banks sell the bonds to the central bank. Cool. Put our divider over here. And then the last two is going to be that the government pays interest on the bonds held by the banks, and it pays interest on the bonds held by the central bank. All right. So for those, we're going to have the stock of bonds held by the banks and the stock of bonds held by the central bank. So we're going to bring these two guys over. Copy and paste. All right. And as always, the interest payment is going to be defined in terms of the interest rate on those bonds. Okay. So we'll have the interest rate that the government pays to the central bank, and the interest payment that the government pays to the banks. All right, is going to be related to just the sum of all of the bonds held by the banks, the sum of all the bonds held by the Fed, and it's going to be multiplied by the rate of interest on government bonds. Right now, the rate of interest on government bonds, the rate of interest on bonds is going to be 5.25%, which is the effective Fed funds rate. However, once again, we're going to start with an initial value of 0, a maximum value of 100%, minimum value of 0%, and we're going to go in step sizes of, let's call it, let's actually go for increments of 25 basis points, all right? Because the Fed likes to hike rates by 25 basis points at a time. Okay, so we'll have that guy over there, and they're going to be paying the same amount of interest. The interest rate on the bonds is going to be the same. So, just assuming that they're buying the same maturity, or you can simplify it that all maturities have the same rate. Doesn't really matter. This is going to be an illustrative model, just so that we can get the basic idea of what of how these things change as we vary the parameters. Okay, so we're going to have, oops, if I can undo that. Oops, where did my, here we are. Okay, come back. Can I undo? I can't undo. Alright, so let me just bring this over here, and bring this over here, and just rename these guys. Okay. So this guy was that the banks sell bonds. Banks sell bonds to the central bank. Okay. Over here, we're going to have that the government pays interest on the bonds held by the banks. Government pays interest to the banks. To the banks. Pays interest to the banks. All right. And we're going to have that the government pays interest to the central bank. Government pays interest to the central bank. To the central bank. Okay. Cool. Add some dividers over here. Bring this down a little bit. And now we have the whole balance sheet from above in wire diagram form. Okay. And so the last thing that I'm going to do is I am going to also define two more quantities. All right, these are going to be bonus quantities that don't actually appear on the balance sheet, but that we are going to plot. Okay. So I'll come over here. Actually, you know what? I'll put it over here. I'll put it over here. So I'll put it over here. Take this. Put that over there. And what I'm going to define is I'm going to define another debt ratio. I'm going to define the debt ratio, which is going to be the debt ratio of the government. Okay? This is going to be the debt ratio. Oops. This is my note. So this is going to be the public debt to GDP ratio. Okay. There we go. Public debt to GDP ratio. And the public debt to GDP ratio will have the symbol debt sub ratio of the government. All right. Okay. It'll be a flow. Yep. And it is just going to be a simple ratio of the GDP to the public debt outstanding, which is the public debt or the bonds held by the private banks. Okay. Why is it going to be only the bonds held by the banks? Because even though the Federal Reserve is a private corporation, it was established through a congressional statute. It is obligated by law to pay any profits to the Treasury, and it can only do what Congress tells it to do and has empowered it to do. Okay, so it's essentially just another branch of the government, even though it likes to, say it's independent, right? It's not really independent, but it's also not completely dependent either, because they have the authority and the authority to make their own decisions of what they feel is best for the economy at any particular time, given the charter that it was endowed with by Congress. Okay, so now we have all of the wiring diagrams set up, and the last thing that I'm going to do for this video is I'm going to take this quantity that I have, and I'm going to take these quantities over here. All right. And I'm going to copy them and paste them into one of my plots that I've already got set up over here. Okay, paste them over here. So the debt ratio of the government is going to go next to the debt ratio of the non-government. So the private debt to GDP and the public debt to GDP is going to be over here. And then the bonds held by the Fed and the bonds held by the private banks are going to go over here to the public debt holdings chart. Okay, so this is going to be the bonds, which are the public debt held by the private sector, which is the banks, and held by the Fed, which is, in a sense, the public sector. Okay, the public debt held by the banks and the public debt held by the government. Okay. So now that all of those are wired up, I will end the video here, and we'll pick up in the next one and see what happens as we play around with those rates that we defined over here. All of these different, the rate of interest, the rate of purchases of bonds, which is the open market operations, the rate of taxing, the rate of spending, okay? All of that, all of these parameters are what we are going to vary and play around with in the next video and gauge their impact on the overall economy, okay? So we'll stop it here and catch you in the next one.